friends, and welcome to the second session of our study of the book of Revelation. In our first session, we learned that the book of Revelation is distinguished from the other biblical books in the New Testament by presenting Revelation in the form of a vision or a series of visions. And we also learned that these visions are specially written out in symbolic language in these kinds of books, in a book like the book of Revelation. We studied some examples of this symbolic language last time as illustrations of the difficulty of reading this kind of book without knowing something of what these words stand for. Let's review what we did at the board and add a new important trait that will help us further to understand this difficult book. We saw last time that this new kind of prophecy is generally called apocalyptic because of the Greek word apocalypse. Here's the Greek word, here's the transliteration into Latin letters, here's the meaning of the word, revelation. And we saw last time that it contrasts, this kind of prophecy, contrasts with classical prophecy, such as in Amos and Hosea and Isaiah and Jeremiah, by presenting revelation not in oracle form, which is a thus says the Lord form, but in vision form. But not only that, whereas the oracles in the classical prophets are in plain language, the visions in apocalyptic prophecy are in symbolic language. That's as far as we've gone. Now we need to add a new trait. Classical prophecy assumes as its background an old Israelite cosmology, whereas the apocalyptic books in their background, this kind of prophecy assumes a different kind of cosmology. Now here's another technical word, cosmology. We have to distinguish between these two types of cosmology. It may be easier for us to do that if we look at another chart, which will take this Greek word cosmos, which is here translated the world, and here transliterated into letters that we can read, cosmos, meaning the universe, the whole universe. Therefore, the study of the whole universe is a new kind of study called cosmology. The way one understands the universe we live in, the way one studies, so to speak, or speaks a word about the universe, is the field of cosmology. Now we have in Scripture two distinctly different cosmologies. One of them I'm labeling the old Israelite cosmology. It's the older of the two. And the other one, later Jewish cosmology. Remember, cosmology means an understanding of the universe. Now this old Israelite cosmology is what dominates the Old Testament. Some of the New as well, but dominates the Old Testament. In this cosmology, this understanding of the universe, Yahweh, there's the name Yahweh written in Hebrew. This is sometimes more familiar to you, perhaps, as Jehovah. But Jehovah is an incorrect way to translate or to transliterate this word Yahweh. So we use either this form or sometimes Yahweh. But Yahweh is a Jewish preferred way of doing this, so we'll stick to that. This Yahweh, this ruler of the universe, was also the creator, and that's all there is to the world. There's one creator, ruler, God, and this one creator, ruler, God rules over everything. That's a simple view of the universe. That's the point of view that you presuppose behind most of the Old Testament. If you want to understand the book of Genesis, or Psalms, or Proverbs, or the prophets, or the book of Kings, or any of those kinds of things, well then, in the Old Testament, then you want to assume this understanding of things. Everything comes from God, the good and the bad alike. If it's bad, it's God sending discipline or punishment on His people for their wickedness. If it's good, it's God rewarding the people for their obedience. It's a simple picture. It's what I'm calling the old Israelite cosmology. Now, if you understand this well, so that you can go to any part of the Old Testament, or almost any part, and read it with some understanding, if you understand that well, you are not able to read and make any sense out of the book of Revelation. It does not presuppose this worldview. It presupposes a different worldview. And the worldview that it presupposes is this later Jewish cosmology. This later Jewish cosmology is one which sees as the central element in understanding the universe we live in a cosmic war going on. This cosmic war is a war between good forces and evil forces. At the head of the good forces is Yahweh, or God, the Hebrew God. At the head of the evil forces is the enemy. This is the word in Hebrew which means the enemy, Hasatan. Hasatan is a transliteration of this Hebrew name for the enemy, Hasatan. We've cut the article out, no longer use it as a descriptive title, and just talk about the war between God and Satan. The cosmic war going on everywhere in the universe between God and Satan. That's the presupposition that lies behind the apocalyptic writings, like the book of Revelation, this later Jewish cosmology. We have to assume a cosmic war going on. God is fighting against the forces of evil. These forces of evil are trying to take over the universe. God is trying to prevent that and take the universe back away from them. Right now, in the present state of the war, the whole earth is under the rule of the evil one. The evil one, Satan, is in control of this earth in this understanding of things. Now we'll look at some passages in the book of Revelation which will illustrate this late Jewish cosmology, help you to see more clearly some of the elements in this. There are some factors in this that we will explain only when we get to the text, but they're important factors, and we'll start with a key passage in chapter 12. It's simply explained, and so we'll begin with verse 7. Now war arose in heaven. Michael and his angels, Michael is the general of the Lord's army, of Yahweh's army, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. The dragon is a code name for Satan, as this very passage will explain. The dragon and his angels fought, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven, saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they have loved not their lives even unto death. This is a reference to Christian martyrdom again. Now we have the summary of all this. Rejoice then, O heaven, and you that dwell therein. Why? Because the war is over in heaven. Satan has been kicked out of heaven, so to speak, thrown down to the earth. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows his time is short. Now we're going to deal with the time element in this in another session. But this is a good illustration of the stage of the cosmic war according to the book of Revelation. The war is over in heaven, but it's not over on earth. The devil is doing his best to win the war yet, but his time is short, and the end of the story is going to be the defeat of the devil and the victory of the good side. There is, in connection with this understanding of things, there is in connection with this a package of doctrines. Maybe package might sound irreverent. I don't mean to be irreverent, but it's a group of doctrines which are almost always found together. And they're found together in this theological system, this late Jewish cosmology. I'll describe these doctrines first, and then we'll illustrate each of them from the book of Revelation. Since the war is almost over, the end of the story, of course, is that the good side is going to win the war. All these apocalyptic writings tell about the cosmic war, and they all predict that the good side is going to win. But there's a series of events near the very end, a series of events that happen in successive order that always are the same in these apocalyptic writings, whether they're biblical or outside the Bible. And here's what that series of events is. There will be a last battle, one final great last battle, and that will be led by the Son of Man who comes on the clouds to lead that great battle. So the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds at the head of an army to fight the last battle will win the cosmic war and end the war. As soon as the war is over, everybody who's ever lived will be raised from the dead. There will be a general resurrection of all the persons who've ever lived. The purpose of the general resurrection is to give them justice. The good people will now get their rewards, and the wicked people will now get their punishments. So everybody who ever lived, those in the sea and those in the land, will be raised from the dead and now go before the judge. This is the last judgment scene. In the last judgment scene, everybody raised from the dead again in their bodies goes before the judge and is tried. The judge has books, record books. These are record books which have recorded everything you've ever done. And the judge reviews in the record books your whole life and then sentences you. If you are a good person, you get to pass into the new age. If you're a wicked person, then you suffer the eternal torments and fate of Satan and his enemy army who's just been defeated. The last judgment is therefore a final separation for all time into eternity, a final separation of the good and the bad. And if you're good and pass into the new age, then you will forever be with God in an age that has no more evil in it, no more suffering, no more sorrow, no more pain, no more death, no more darkness. Everything is good in this new age, and there is no bad things, because all those bad things came from Satan, and Satan is now out of the picture. That's the cluster of doctrines. Maybe cluster is a better word than package, but that's the cluster of doctrines which accompanies this kind of theology. Now we'll see that all of these appear in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation describes, in its visions, highly symbolic language, describes each of these things, and sometimes it describes them 3 times, 2 times or 3 times. In the case of the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds, that's described 3 times. We'll look at one of these. The one that we'll look at is in chapter 15, and we'll begin at verse 14. Then I looked, and lo, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Now this terminology, son of man, prevails in all the Jewish literature and in some of the Christian. When Christians took this idea over, they had to, of course, translate this coming of the Son of Man into the return of Christ. So Christians read the coming of the Son of Man as the second coming of Christ, the return of Christ. But it's the same image. Even if it's in its Jewish form, the coming of the Son of Man, the Christians have said the coming of the Son of Man, properly understood, is the second coming of Christ, the return of Christ, at the head of the Lord's army to win the last battle and end the cosmic war. Now we'll go back to our passage and look a little further here now. Another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat upon the cloud, "Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe." So he who sat upon the cloud swung his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. Now notice, we'll look at this again, but notice now that this is an agricultural symbol. The symbolism is drawn from the fields, where one uses a sickle and reaps the grain or harvests it. This is the Lord's harvest of the earth. It's highly symbolic, but that fits in with the symbolic nature of the language all the way through these books. This is the story of the last battle, put in symbolic terms, this time of agriculture. Let's go back now and see what happens at the end of this by continuing at verse 17. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Then another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has power over fire, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Put in your sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered the vintage of the earth, and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. That's about 200 miles. Now you can see the switch here from an agricultural symbol of harvesting grapes and then treading on the grapes in order to out, which was a common custom in ancient times. You can see the transition from that into the actual slaughter scene in the last battle when the wicked people are being harvested. It's an image which is very vivid, and out of this we get some great songs and some great artwork. You know, the wrath of God, the vintage of the wrath of God restored, where the grapes of wrath are stored, those kinds of things all grow out of this passage. That's one example of one doctrine, of this cluster of doctrines which accompanies this kind of theology, this understanding of the universe we live in. Now the next stage is to see that last battle. We already saw the battle in connection with the coming of the Son of Man in one place. Let's look at another shorter passage in which a very famous word is used. Very popular in describing all this last battle in this cosmic war. And now we're in chapter 16 at verse 12. The sixth angel poured his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, to prepare the way for the kings from the east. We'll have more to say about this later. And I saw, issuing from the mouth of the dragon, that's Satan, and the mouth of the beast, that's Satan's agent on earth, and from the mouth of the false prophet, 3 foul spirits like frogs, for they are demonic spirits performing signs, who go abroad to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for battle on the great day of God the Almighty. The great day is the last battle, the day when God will finally win. Lo, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is he who is awake, keeping his garments, that he may not go naked and be seen exposed. And they assemble them, the nations of the world, at a place which is called in Hebrew Armageddon. This is the famous Battle of Armageddon, the last battle in the cosmic war. Now we need to look more closely at that word, but we can't do very much with it. What we have to do is make a comment about this. It is a word which is supposed to be a Hebrew word according to the text, but it occurs nowhere in Hebrew literature. In fact, it occurs nowhere in any literature except in this one place. It's a word, therefore, which cannot be studied in its context. It cannot be studied how it's used in other places. It's a word which has only this one existence. Furthermore, the manuscripts of the book of Revelation spell this word 5 different ways. So there's no surety about what the spelling ought to be. All we can do is guess what this word means. It is certainly one of the great unknowns that locates the last battle in Israel in that great plain down below the ancient city of Megiddo. That was a plain on which many ancient battles were fought, and it's conceivable at least that this author understands the last battle to take place in Israel and the plain below the ancient ruined city of Megiddo. Now let's look at another reference which will bring together some things all at once in a short passage. What it brings together is the way in which the cluster of events at the very end, the way in which they are put together as a kind of great climax. In verse 11 of chapter 20, I saw a great white throne and him who sat upon it. This is the judgment scene. From his presence earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne. And books were opened. And also another book was opened, which is the book of life. You have an intermixture here of 2 sets of books. You have a set of books which records the deeds. Then you have another book called the book of life. And these are separate all the way through the book of Revelation. We'll comment briefly on each as we get to the passage. The dead were judged by what was written in the books, by what they had done. So here salvation is dependent upon righteous behavior, and that's a basic principle in the book of Revelation. It's the quality of our ethical life that determines whether or not we enter into the new age. The dead were judged by what was written in the books, by what they had done. The sea gave up the dead in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead in them. That's the underworld. And all were judged by what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. The book of life is a concept inherited by the Jews from the Persians, in which the names in advance of all the saved are written. And the Jews adopted that point of view and weave it into this judgment based on the deeds that are all written down in the books. Well, there we have the culmination of all these cluster of doctrines. We have the coming of the Son of Man to fight the last battle. We have another passage in which the battle is to take place at a place called Armageddon. We have the resurrection of all the dead, those in the sea and those in the land, and they all come before the great judge. In the Jewish versions of this, God is the judge, and in some Christian versions, God is the judge. But in most Christian versions, Jesus Christ is the judge. Book of Revelation is more Jewish than this, and therefore simply assumes that God is on the throne as the great judge. So there we have the qualifications now for entering into the new age, the last final judgment. And that last final judgment is what separates everybody into those who are allowed to pass into the new age and those who are thrown into the lake of fire, or thrown into a punishment center, we would say, sociologically speaking, which is already inhabited by Satan and his angels. That's the beginnings, in a way, of our traditional concept of two destinies for all of us, a heavenly destiny for some and a hellish destiny for others, a reward destiny for some and a punishment destiny for others. All that belongs to this kind of thinking, this kind of theology. Now, we've seen here this cosmology, this very important cosmology, and how this cosmology is different from the old Israelite cosmology. It's a cosmology which is still very popular. A lot of people in the Christian church, because of the vividness of the story in the book of Revelation, are still clinging to this. What we have to do next is a harder job than what we've done so far. What we need to do next, and we will do in detail in the next session, is to look at the way in which this apocalyptic theology, this late Jewish cosmology, always believes that we're in the last days of this great cosmic war, that the war will be over in the generation of those who are reading and writing the books. And that's characteristic of the book of Revelation too. But the demonstration of that is something that we'll have to reserve for another occasion. But that means that whatever the book of Revelation, however it refers to history, it refers to the history of New Testament times, not to some later time. And we have to deal very frankly with that as we explore further the meaning of this cosmology. Now let's review just a little bit and see what we've done so far. Trying to understand this difficult book has led us to see that it belongs with a whole series of other books. We have to study this in context with other books like it, some of which are in the Bible, most of which are not. Only by putting it in its proper classification can we understand what the main message is. When we do that, we see that all these books present a message through visions, and the visions are always symbolic language. And this symbolic language is one that we sometimes know the answer to and sometimes don't. Sometimes we know the answer because it's given to us in the text, or it's broadly hinted at in the text. Sometimes we have to figure it out, and we can figure it out by hints or clues that are given in the text. We'll do more with that next time. Sometimes we just don't know. We have to confess this is code language. What it means is no longer available to us. We just have to say, I do not know what it means. One thing you can be sure of, if somebody is able to explain to you with great clarity what the book of Revelation means, and they do not follow these kinds of guidelines, the only thing you can be sure of is that they're making it all up, because we simply do not know. This is code language, better known in the ancient world than now, and we have glimmerings of what it's all about. And the general outlines are pretty plain, but the specific details are not. So we'll be cautious as we proceed with this book and try to be honest and fair with it, see what it's saying, let it speak for itself. Now let's think about some questions that we might raise on the basis of what we've been discussing so far. Have you ever speculated as to what the universe is really like? Well, I suspect everybody has. What is the universe really like in your judgment? Do you have a concept of the universe already? If you do, is it this cosmic war concept? Do you believe we live on the battlefield of a great war between forces of evil and forces of good? Is the book of Revelation on the right track in understanding the universe we live in, the environment of human existence? Or do you have problems with this? Remember now, we've already seen two different biblical cosmologies. It's not a matter of one being right because it's in the Bible. The old Israelite cosmology is also biblical. In fact, it dominates more of the Bible than this late Jewish cosmology, which presupposes a cosmic war between God and Satan. What is the universe really like? What is your concept of it? Now let's look at a second question that you might discuss too. How do you relate, personally, how do you relate to the old Israelite cosmology? The first question is how you relate to this late Jewish cosmology. Now I'm asking you to think about and to discuss among yourselves, how do you relate with your understanding of the universe to the old Israelite cosmology? Do you think that that's closer to modern scientific understandings of the universe than the cosmic warfare concept? In what senses Can you place yourself in the picture here and relate yourself to either one of these, or perhaps in some way to both of them? That's a fruitful discussion topic before we proceed on with the next stage of understanding this concept of the world we live in. In the next stage, we'll do the hardest of all the jobs. Need your thinking caps for next time, because we're going to deal with the time element in all this and show that it's very likely that the prophecies of the book of Revelation have to do with events at the end of the first century and have nothing at all to do with our times. But for that, we'll have to defer to the next time. That'll be our main topic then. So keep your wits about you and come back and join us next time.